From Studio A at the USC Annenberg School, this is Tyke Jones, your host from the Paradigm Podcast here at by Shift SC. Today we are speaking to Elisa Warford, our faculty advisor at Shift SC. She is an associate professor in the Engineering and Society program where she teaches engineering communications, technology ethics, and climate change ethics. Please welcome our guest, Elisa Warford. Do you think the nature of free speech changed after the advent of the internet?
I don't know if the nature of free speech itself changed, but maybe the way we think of free speech and whether our kind of traditional and historical ways of thinking of free speech may have changed. And so I think, for example, that if I can get a little bit academic here. So John Stuart Mill in his piece on liberty talks about three reasons that we want to have free speech. And one is that we might not be right. I mean, right? Like we need diversity of opinion because we don't know, we want to figure out which one is true. And so my own opinion might not be right. And so I need to hear other views. Another reason is we might be partly right, but then the other side might be partly right, right? So we might have some kernel of truth, but that sort of probably one person doesn't have access to the whole and complete truth. And again, like we're fallible in our beliefs, right? We might believe some things that are false. And so challenging that can be useful. And then another is even if we are right, that we might want like challenges so that like our beliefs don't just sort of harden and ossify into dogma, right? Like we want to just like always be keeping those ideas alive and resonant and all of this. So John Stuart Mill was like a big proponent of free speech, but even for him, it wasn't absolute, right? You can't like you do speech that harms, like that it's going to cause like physical harm to someone, like inciting a riot, or something like that. And so I think the question is, and so, free speech is really valuable for in a liberal society, in a liberal democracy like ours. But the question is now that we have like social media, in some way it's a great technology for free speech, right? And all of us, can have a voice. All of us can speak one to many, many to many. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And so there are some really good features about social media, for democracy. On the other hand, though, we've obviously seen, like maybe abuses of that free speech where now fringe groups can be their voices can be amplified where they might not have reached very many people before. Now they have a platform where they can reach many people, and we see like a rise in extremism, right? Because these people can find each other, and we see a rise. We see hate speech, and we see bullying, and misinformation, right?
Misinformation, yes.
And so I think, right, people are starting to question, like, we do want free speech, but does like sort of this very strong, view like Mill's on free speech, does that still like really work in our society today? Are sort of the harms that can be caused by these things like misinformation and hate speech and extremism, does that call for some kind of content moderation, right? And if these platforms are sort of in effect like our public square, right, where we exchange ideas, then do we need to have some kind of guardrails on that? It's a tough question, right? And then the companies are private companies, so they can kind of make their own legally. They can make their own policies, but it raises questions then about their power to control, the type of speech that people are having, and who's making these decisions? How do you make these decisions, especially given the huge volume of speech, right? We have tons and tons of speech.
Yeah. I feel like after the printing press, like newspapers became a
Yeah.
thing, and that created the idea of the freedom of the press. Do you think something
Yeah.
similar to that for social media, like Twitter or something, would be legal, not legalized, but like established as a new law or like new idea where there's a different version of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but applied to that kind of technology? Or do you think there's a necessity for it?
Like a different, sorry, can you repeat that?
So after the printing press, that technology, you
Yeah.
have the newspaper.
Right, right.
So there's freedom of the press is a new idea that developed after that. Do you think something like that will happen with social media, where it's like a variation of freedom of speech?
Right. I think we've got already probably got the basic framework. I mean, but if you're talking about sort of how, the technology of the printing press, right? This makes print culture like widely accessible to, where only clergy, had access to scripture, right? Like had access to the Bible, and so people had to just trust what the clergy was saying. But now they could read it for themselves, right? And that makes a huge difference, and that's really good, right? Because people can kind of see it themselves and make their own judgments. And so right, and then right, you have the free press. I think that there are, like, in terms of journalism, right? There are some laws around, what a newspaper can print. Actually, more so than I think. I'm getting into waters that I'm not like expert on, but right, but the press, has a duty to, the free press has a duty to try to report factually. Not, you can't libel people, you can't slander people, and so, right, there's like FCC regulations, about political ads and campaigns, right? So I don't know, maybe do we need something, this is a big debate, right? Do we need something like that for social media? Do we need some kind of government regulation for social media companies? I don't know. My own view is that you should be very hesitant to curb speech, but you can make the argument too that, if certain platforms are so like toxic and people could be kind of like, could be psychologically harmed by them, or feel that, or whose voices are chilled,
Or spread disinformation.
It's I don't have a perfect position on this. I think you should be very hesitant to chill free speech, but in some cases I think it's getting so, right, there are questions of public harm, right? So like with the coronavirus, people could be harmed physically by misinformation about the coronavirus, and so the companies did start to label it or tag it, right, things like that. But then, right, there's like blowback even from that, because then for some groups, like getting some kind of label or flag, it would be a sign that, oh, you should believe this, right? Let's spread this one, right? It was like it was motivating them the wrong way. So there's no like, there's no like neutral, I don't think there's like a neutral position, because even labeling, I think, you're putting your thumb on
You're touching it, yeah.
right, on the scale.
What do you think of, I think Elon Musk, after he bought Twitter and he made it into X, a major reason he did that was because he felt that, well, he needed to like protect freedom of expression, stuff like that. And he stated in his policy that freedom of speech will be protected, but freedom of reach wouldn't be protected. So some ideas that were expressed, if they don't align with the policy, then they might not receive the boost with the algorithm. What do you think of that kind of policy?
Right. So I know Elon claims he's a free speech absolutist, right? I don't think he actually is, because he is doing these kinds of things, right? He's kicking people off of the platform. He's changing, right? He's making it so you can't block posts. I don't know if that if he walked that back, right? He is promoting, right, people with the blue check who are paying for it. So this is not, and at Tesla, Tesla has fired employees for speaking out against like harassment and things like that. So I don't think he actually is a free speech absolutist. I think it's maybe a little free speech for me, but not for thee. And so the algorithms that, right, he's making decisions about speech. He's not just saying this is like an open forum for all, right? And because those algorithms are not just neutral, and none of the platform's algorithms are neutral, right? You're going to either promote this kind of post or you're going to promote that kind of post, right? And or I don't know, you're going to do it randomly, and then that's a choice too. All of those have like implications for speech.
Maybe that's where we should be focusing on, like what kind of content we want to promote.
Yeah.
A question about how do you think social media, like digital interfaces and the internet more broadly, has changed the way humans interact with each other and our environment, and what kinds of effects do you think has it had on society?
Yeah, I think it's had huge effects, right? I think we're running this big social experiment right now on how we interact with each other and mental health and how we regard each other. And so again, like there's all of these technologies, have like certain affordances, right? And they allow you, or they make it easier for you to act in a certain way, or they make it harder for you to act in another way, right? And so even just say like texting, it's a tiny box, right? And so that's gonna invite you to have very short conversations, right? Like it doesn't make sense to have this long, in-depth conversation on this tiny little text box, right? And it's going to, right? It's going to make you, it's going to invite you to, or use emojis, right? And things that are like subject to sort of to misinterpretation. And so that's going to change the way we interact. Like it can be super helpful, right? It can make it, right? And it invites us to maybe communicate more. So, just quick, oh, good. This lets me, say I'm going to be late for dinner, or, don't forget to let the cat out, like things like that, or quick hi. And that's great. But like for other kinds of relationships, like is it changing the way, and like things like Twitter too, right? Short, right? These that prioritize like short
It's like
bursts
a word limit,
of, right? Like little sound bites of, right? Twitter limits it, right? That's gonna invite certain kinds of speech, and it's again short soundbite kind of speech. And so if we, maybe we lose something if we really start relying on those short form, speech. Maybe because we are less face to face, right? There's all kinds of questions about this. If we don't interact as much face to face, maybe we it's harder to see the other person as another human, right? And it's easier to treat them badly, like that you would never do, or it would be harder for you to do face to face, right? It would be harder sort of psychologically to, like break up with someone, right? Say something that they don't want to hear.
Yeah.
Or flake, or flake out on, right, some commitment that you had, like, oh yeah, something came up, I'm not going to be there for dinner tonight. I think it does in some ways, like
like the confrontations you can just say off a text, not even call them.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think the anonymity and how widely available it is, how's that changed like human psychology? Are we more inclined towards sociopathic behavior?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Like scientifically, right? Do we have more sociopaths? But certainly, and again, anonymity can help people, right? Like it can, um, again, people can find like their people, right? So if they're struggling with, a mental health issue, or they're struggling to find people that they think can understand what they're going through, right? This is great that the internet can help. Or just, you have some little niche interest, you can find your people online. But when it's anonymous, and people may disclose more, right? Like they can speak freely under sort of the cloak of anonymity. And so if this helps them express themselves, in ways that they would be vulnerable, if they had to use their name, they can disclose more, and that's maybe good in some situations.
Like whistleblowers.
Like whistleblowers, right? Or even like if you're like, I don't know, seeking some kind of like support group, right? Like, or some kind of therapy where you can say like, oh my gosh, I'm going through all of this. I can't tell any of my friends, but you can disclose to people. On the other hand, just like like you said, like it also means people can do very bad things under under the cloak of anonymity. So like cyberbullying and again, like hate speech and
like trolling and
like
stuff.
trolling. Yeah.
It's interesting because, on one hand you have that potential for whistleblowers, and it can help out people. You can seek out therapy and stuff like that, but also can cause sociopathic behaviors.
Yeah. Well, and then like the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, right? Who?
What did he do?
She was high up in Facebook and worked on like their civil. I can't remember the name exactly off the top of my head, but she exposed publicly that Facebook's own research showed that Instagram was bad for teenage girls' mental health, right? So again, like if you're talking about how do we relate to each other, they knew that teenage girls used Instagram, and that made them feel worse about themselves, made them feel worse about their bodies, made them feel like they were missing out, that everybody had better lives than them, and that this was affecting their mental health. And like that, oh well, I'm not as pretty as her, I'm not as thin as her, I'm not as rich as her, I'm not, like it's having effects on teenage girls' mental health. There's some people dispute this still, but it does seem like the research is kind of converging on like that this is the most likely sort of cause for the rise in mental health problems for young women.
Oh, really? Yeah, especially because Facebook, it was in-house research, it'd be biased towards saying that there wasn't really.
Right, but even their own research, showed suggested that this was happening, and that they know that the posts that get the most eyeballs and the most attention are like inflammatory, right? They're extreme, and so those posts are going to keep your attention on the platform, and so they're promoting those posts because that way they can sell more ads. And so they know too that these kind of not so much teenage girls, but like political, right? Like extreme political posts, right? That might be inflammatory, that might, that are extreme, are going to get the most eyeballs. And so Facebook also knows this, and yet they promote those posts, right? Because it's going to get them advertising. So it's changing the way, right? Like, so again, it's changing the way we're interacting with each other too, because it's polarizing us, right? Because our views. So what it does is we get into our echo chambers, right? Because it also just gives us posts that we want to hear, we want to see, that we've indicated that we're interested in, right? And so we get kind of shuffled into this like echo chamber or filter bubble, right? Where then that's like all we're getting, and we get more and more extreme posts that are going to like reaffirm our beliefs and actually make us believe this more strongly. And we're not getting actually even that free speech exchange where your views are challenged by the other, right? By another position, by another opinion. We're just kind of locked in. And so we're not talking to each other. And we're all getting we're getting more extreme in our views. And I think that social media has had a big part of that in that.
Because when it's a digital interaction, you can just turn the other person off or like block them.
And that's another thing, right? You can block them if you want,
You can't
right?
do that in person.
Right, you can't do that in person. You know, like you can't. There was this I just thought it was so almost like moving. This was when Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court justice, was being confirmed. And if you remember, he was accused of sexual assault by Christine Blasey Ford. And, so she had told her story. There was this big debate, very heated, right? Like very heated issue about whether he had done this. He denied it. Very contentious. And so there was like a lot of protests against his confirmation in the Supreme Court. And a woman, this was caught on tape, so one of the senators, Jeff Flake, I think he indicated that he would vote to confirm him. And a woman came up to him in Congress and just was just so emotional, and protesting. She's like, how can you look at me and vote for him? How can you explain how you're going to look at me? And you could tell, she was very passionate, and you could tell that he was uncomfortable, and he couldn't, again, just block her, not pay attention to her. He had to confront her. He had to be in that space where he had to listen to her. So that's another, I think you're right. That's another way that it changes. We can, if it's not convenient for us, we just don't have to listen or respond or look at it. We can block it, right?
Yeah, just silence it. Yeah.
Just silence it. Yeah.
Do you think, talking about court cases, I guess, relating to that, because everyone has a phone now, you can tape anything. Do you think the nature of privacy changed? There's also IoT devices within our home, so even the bedroom, which might be the most private of all rooms, even that might have a Google Nest or something that might be listening. We don't really know.
No, I definitely am worried about privacy, and similarly, maybe with free speech, right? We've had these ideas about privacy, although privacy is really actually hard to define, but we've had these, sort of principles related to free speech, principles related to privacy, and maybe the question is, do those principles still sort of work? Can we expect privacy? Do we value privacy anymore? Do we need privacy? I would say we still really do. And that privacy, it serves many purposes, right? And again, some can be bad, right? If there's a lack of transparency, privacy can be bad, right? Bad things can happen behind closed doors, right? And sunlight, there's the saying, sunlight's the best disinfectant, right? But also, you need privacy for your own autonomy, for your own individuality. You need to have a private sphere where you're not under surveillance, where you're not fearful of being called out, right? Where you can experiment with ideas, where you can talk with your friend or your family, right? And you can say what do you think about this? And you can have this exchange without worrying that something's going to come back to, it's going to be broadcast, right, all over the internet. And we have no control over the data that we give up to our to all of these tech companies, you know, and we don't know what they're doing with it, and we don't get all. The only benefit we get, I think, is it's targeted ads. It's like, why?
A little convenient
Who
stuff.
cares?
Yeah.
Like, I don't care, right? If I have to look a little further on Amazon for the thing I want, like, fine. So yeah, I mean, and you're right. Like, they're in our homes. I walk around my neighborhood, and I get messages. I like something will say, "Heads up, you're being recorded." I'm like, why am I being recorded?
Oh, wow.
I just want to walk around my neighborhood without being recorded.
How does that work?
It's like, I guess it's like Ring doorbell. You know, like the Ring doorbells.
You get a notification?
No, it was like, well, it must not just be the Ring doorbell. It must be some other camera, like, right, like mounted on their garage or something that's like motion sensor. And then maybe I assume, like when I walk by, it trips the motion sensor and then it gives me this message.
Oh.
Right.
That makes sense. So it sends it to your phone?
No, it says it out loud.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah, there's like a
wow,
little speaker.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many things to say about privacy and surveillance. I think one of the difficulties too is that I think people are becoming more aware of some of the risks of all of this data collection and infringement on our privacy. But I've had a hard time, I think, like convincing students that it's important, because it's not easy to see the harms, right? From, like, well, I don't care if, I don't have anything to hide. I don't care if Google reads my emails. I don't care if, right, Google Nest, knows I'm home or not. So it's hard to get people to see why it's important. But I think it is because it leaves us open, I think, to manipulation. It leaves us open to abuse of our data. It leaves us open to, mistakes with our data. And there's just very little ways to correct those things. And so and I think overall, I think it may have like a chilling effect, right? Like if someone's being recorded, they're going to watch what they say.
Yeah, they're going to act differently if you know you're being watched.
Yeah.
And if you're like developing contrarian ideas, maybe you don't really want to bring it out to the public space too.
Yeah. No, I have, there's a lot to say. LA just, Governor Newsom just signed a bill that will allow speed cameras and on roads to give like tickets to a car, right, if they're speeding. And so on the one hand, there's terrible speeding, right? Especially it seems like after the pandemic. I think traffic fatalities are on the rise a lot. And I know on a street a block from me, like people just, they speed. They go so fast. They drag race at night. There've been accidents. It's really bad. And I think that the speed cameras that they're considering now, they don't use facial recognition. They just read the license plate. And so hopefully that could allay some of the privacy concerns. But the problem with facial recognition is that it unfairly, it misidentifies, right, people of color and women. And it's less accurate.
Women as well, I did not know that.
Yeah, which is really bad because then those are the people that then their faces that if they're misidentified, they might get drawn into the criminal justice system unfairly, right? Like, and and then this sets off like
Yeah.
can set
Even
off a
if you
whole.
don't get charged, it's a lot of
Yeah,
time. Just like
yeah,
that. Yeah.
right. Your fingerprint is now in the
Yeah.
database. Your
Mm.
face is now in the database, right? You've maybe had to spend time in jail.
Mm.
So there's
Mm.
big problems with that.
Do you know why women get misidentified? I know for colored people,
I
they have a
think
less training
women
data.
also. I hope I
Yeah.
didn't misspeak, but
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not
It's
sure
less training data.
actually. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
Oh, interesting.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. You're talking about how how it's hard to get people like students interested in
Yeah,
the issue of
yeah. What's
privacy.
your take on
Right.
that?
I actually had more of a question about the how you teach that kind of thing, where like you teach a course about the intersection of
Mm-hmm.
technology and ethics.
Mm-hmm.
How do you try to get people interested in and care about these issues?
I know. I do try to. Okay. So one of the things that we do is I teach ethics, technology, and value
Mhm.
course, and I co-teach it with fabulous philosophy professor Jake Ross. Um, but what we'll often do is sort of we'll start maybe with like the philosophical question, and so like we can start with what is the value of privacy? Like why should we care about privacy? What does privacy mean? What are the benefits of privacy? What are the harms that might come if you don't have privacy? And then right, different ways it's been, privacy's been defined, all of those things, and then some like background information, like what's going on with the tech. What are the technologies that are maybe invading our privacy? So right, I mean, you've got a ton. You've got physical cameras. Surveillance cameras all over our like physical terrain. Our cars. I've just reading that like people don't realize how much data their cars are collecting now, and have like no control over that, don't have any idea what the car companies are doing with this data, but they're recording speed, where you go, what you're doing in the car. Oh my gosh, I heard a hilarious
Wow.
thing that like, how there's the driverless cars in
Yeah.
San Francisco now.
Oh,
You can
really?
you can get a driverless taxi.
Oh, really? I did not
You
know
can
that.
call a
Okay.
driverless taxi, and people are like having sex in the driverless taxi,
Oh.
but there's a camera.
Oh, there's a camera inside the.
There's a camera, an inside camera.
Oh.
And they're apparently okay with this because like I think there's like some notification that you're on camera.
Wow.
But right, okay, so cars, all of the Internet of Things. Excuse me, I got all excited about the sex in cars.
Maybe they're excited they were being watched or something. I think.
Right? Maybe it was a turn on. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe this was a feature. Right, but Internet of Things, our phones, our all of our devices are, and then talking about like, so one is making students aware, right?
Yeah.
Like here are all the ways that and what they can do with this information and how it might harm people, right? And so it can be used, this information can be used to discriminate, like discriminative pricing, discriminative hiring, employment, right? And so I think I've had some success, I hope, in convincing that students, even if you don't feel like you have anything to hide, that there can be some actual direct harms to other people, right? And that I think it's harder to make the argument that as a society also we need privacy. But I think that I can't remember which tech mogul said privacy is dead, get over it.
Oh yeah, I heard of that.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we should resist that though.
Yeah. 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 Okay, moving on to a different topic. Do you think gene editing on humans will become widely adopted sometime in the future?
Yeah, I think that they're making progress on like single gene mutation, like syndromes with that are like just a single gene mutation, like with they can use CRISPR-Cas9 to treat things. They're already, I think, with like for like sickle cell anemia. I think it gets a lot more, which is amazing, which is so wonderful, right? Like if we could have treatments, I think, for these kinds of things like cystic fibrosis, and um, I have a friend who has a daughter with Rett syndrome, um, and and so if we can develop, treatments for these, I think it would be amazing and wonderful. Um, and I think I think kind of the far, like, it's still pretty far future about like uh, conditions that involve multiple
Multiple genes.
genes, right? Like, and things like intelligence and things like that that are both nature and nurture, right? Like, that are also environmentally determined. I think that's a lot more complex. Um, but it does seem to be here. I was just at a conference, and there was it was an ethics conference, and a scientist from the National Academies was there. He's a neuroscientist, and he was there to say, like, he's like, there are going to be massive advances in biology, in the biological science, with CRISPR and AI and synthetic biology, which is basically you're creating new proteins in the lab that don't exist in nature. So you're actually creating like new forms of life.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Super, super powerful. Oh, quantum computing. He said, right, and he said these are coming soon, and it's going to be like massive. And he said the problem is that they're working on like policies, because we can affect, right? Like, you're not allowed to clone a human, for example. We can have policies that prohibit certain things or guide, the use of certain technologies. He said, but he's like, so there's scientists in the room and there's like industry people. He's like, but there's not enough ethicists in the room. And he was at this conference, like, to say, like, look, ethicists, you guys need to get in the room. And if I can help you do that, like, he wanted to kind of just like build some bridges, which I thought was really cool. But also, it was a little alarming, what his message too, that there's currently not people in the room.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think that it will. Yeah.
Do you think it's one thing to like cure diseases with it,
Yeah.
and then what if it's something like, there's male pattern baldness in my family. Do I want to change that? Can
Right.
I have the genetic
Right, or
therapy
maybe
for that?
you wished your parents had changed your genes so
Yeah.
you wouldn't. Yeah, yeah. It's a really hard question, because it involves a lot of what we think of as like normal versus and able-bodied versus disabled and not normal or deviant in some way, and so even with like the medical, treatments, something like autism, some people, or Down syndrome, disability rights scholars and activists would say that this is maybe something that you don't need to cure. That having Down syndrome, for many people, they have rich and full lives, of course, and they have even maybe in some ways better lives than someone without Down syndrome, and so they would say that we shouldn't think of that as something lesser or worse, that instead it's like society that causes them the harm that comes from having, say, Down syndrome, in terms of like arranging, whatever technologies or our living spaces or system, and prejudice, right? It's people are prejudiced, right? Have discriminate against disabled people, right? But that they argue that that's where the harm comes from. And so using these technologies to like eradicate those kinds of conditions, they would argue devalues those people, and different, ways of living and different kinds of good lives.
Yeah, I also feel like disabilities like that, and even things like intelligence or
Yeah.
personality, for example, that
Yeah.
are they're genetically influenced, but there's an environmental factor for those.
Yeah.
But if you change the genes for those, you kind of change the person itself. So it's almost
Yeah.
as if you're killing the
Exactly.
old person and making
Exactly.
a new person.
Right. Right. So that's what they would argue,
Yeah.
something like that, right? Like, this is part of your identity. This is actually making you. It's an enormous power, right? To have, and so, but other people argue that, say, it's clearly better to be able to hear, because we get like so much pleasure, eh, from beautiful sounds, and we can communicate with, right, with spoken language, and that some philosophers would argue that, in fact, you shouldn't be just allowed to edit genes to avoid maybe something like deafness, which, by the way, the deaf community like really disputes. So not only should you be allowed to use the treatments, but some argue that a parent would be obligated, because to not do that would be, in a way, to like cause a harm to the child, or whatever. So it's a very difficult
Yeah, that's
question.
interesting because I know of I forgot his name, but there's a pianist, and he was born blind, but that made him much more sensitive to sound, and that gives him,
Right.
yeah, the incredible ability to play the piano the way
Right,
he does.
right, and nobody is like saying like he would be forced, like if there was some treatment, right, that he would be, that could cure his blindness, that he would be forced to
Yeah.
to undergo this treatment. So, right, so like for living people, it seems like you would have choice, right? Like you can honor their wishes, right? In most cases, I mean, some people might not have the mental capacity to like make that choice for themselves, and then it gets super complicated as well, right? Because they can't give consent. So if you're like in a coma, or if your mental capacity is so low that you can't like meaningfully give consent, then who gets to decide? But if you're thinking of like parents like editing
Their children.
their
yeah.
children's genes, that's the people in favor, say that should be just the parent's choice. This should not be anything that's mandatory. It should not be, state-run, because you don't want the kinds of horrific eugenics programs that we had in the 20th century. But it's still the parent, is making this choice for this child.
Yeah. Almost mirrors the abortion issue. Yeah, we shouldn't get into that. That'd be too much. But so I'm actually not too sure about the technical aspects of it, but do you think there'll be technology to? It'd probably be much easier to edit the genes of a zygote, like as when it's only a single cell. You only have to edit one single cell genes, and that just populate through the entire body. But is it possible to edit genes after someone's born? So if you're like trying to enhance muscles, like you can just add them to these muscles?
I don't know. I don't know exactly, but for sure, they're using CRISPR to treat sickle cell anemia on people that are living, right? So like as a treatment for people who are living. So I think what it does, I'm not an expert, but right, it goes in, it cuts open the DNA, like, and it can take out the gene that's flawed or whatever, and then it can replace it with another gene. And so you can do it on a living person. There's still, it's still hard. Like there's big questions about off target. Like, so if you do something to this gene, is there going to be an effect on a different gene that you didn't intend? And so that's why it's still in like early
Yeah.
like stages, and so yeah. So, but I think what like this scientist that I mentioned before, uh, he said that AI like can help solve that off-target
Mm.
problem.
Is it the sort of thing where like one gene might program for more than one phenotype?
I don't
That kind
know.
of thing?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
But we're a long way though from
Yeah.
you being able to like go to your clinic and say,
Mhm.
"Oh, give me the gene for stronger
Yeah,
muscles,"
yeah.
right?
We're not there yet.
We're not quite there. I mean, we're
Mhm.
actually a very, very long. I think we're actually a long way
Mhm.
from this like designer baby,
Design. Yeah.
thing. Like even I've read that like eye color is not even that easy
Mm.
um, to change to understand like how which genes are like involved
Mhm.
in that. So we're far away from this designer baby. Although on the other hand, we do have like um, pre-implantation diagnosis. So we do have already technologies where you can do some of this. So you could choose like sex, you could choose for some genetic components. So right, so this would be is if you have like in vitro fertilization and you've got like several embryos,
Mm.
you can fertilized, right? You can test them. You can
Mm.
look at determine their sex. You can test for some conditions, some health
Mm.
conditions,
Mm.
and then you can select the ones that you
Oh.
want. And so
Mm.
already we're doing this
On a smaller capacity
on a smaller
already.
capacity. And there's some regulations, like most clinics won't let you just select for sex,
Yeah.
except like some of them will now, like for like purposes of like uh, family balance, so like if you have like 3 boys and you want a girl, then maybe they'll let you. Um, and I think, yeah. So, right. So but I don't know exactly the level of regulation on that. Like if that's just sort of voluntary regulation or what. But it can be
International.
used
Mm.
for, right, to select against, to deselect for like medical
Mm.
conditions.
Mhm. Yeah. And there's also, I think the big idea about modernity is that our genes are optimized for our primal ancestors and our environment back then. But now that we're in this environment, there's a lot of mismatch between what we want and what our environment provides. So
Yeah.
like we might be really inclined to eat unhealthy foods like potato chips, stuff like that. Do you think there'll be once the technology gets there, do you think we will start to change those genes and change what it means to be a human?
Yeah, I think that we're flirting. It's a enormous power,
Mm.
right? Like where we can actually like change our own bodies in ways that are not, following natural selection, right? And this long, long evolutionary process. As far as the potato chips, I think it would be easier or maybe better just to change the food system that we live
Mm.
under so that
Yeah.
all of these things that were so unhealthy yet cheap and widely available are not,
Yeah. Mm.
right? That we instead have healthy foods that are widely available that, but I've heard like even like with climate change, we could engineer smaller bodies so that we can emit less
Less. Oh
carbon,
wow.
right? Or
Okay.
like that or to engineer like a intolerance for meat, for like
Oh
meat
wow.
eating,
Okay.
right? Because like meat, like beef especially,
Mhm.
contributes tons of emissions
Mhm.
of greenhouse gas emissions. And so if we engineered ourselves to not be able to tolerate meat, then our desire to
Huh.
eat meat would go away.
Wow.
We'd
Or
reduce
or
our
we
emissions, right?
could engineer the cows differently so they don't emit
Right.
as
I
much.
think that they are actually trying
They're
to do
trying to.
that. I think they are, right? And whether
Huh.
it's through food, like they're trying to give them like food, like seaweed
Oh.
diets that reduce the methane, but they
Yeah.
might also be I wonder if they could also engineer the
Somehow
cows
change that.
themselves
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, because we think about like what our preferences are now, and versus what, like, they're contingent on our society, and so if what if the preferences change, so like what if you design your baby to conform to, say, very conventional ideas of beauty, but then like those ideas of beauty change over time, right? Like, the question of whether we'd know, how do you know what the best thing to design for is? Um, and again, too, I don't know, with the climate change question, well, maybe, like the potato chip question, maybe we should work on climate change instead of like, right? Maybe we should, right? Like, yeah, instead of altering our bodies like in that way. I don't know. I'm not saying it's obviously wrong to do something like that.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot to think about there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then who would it be voluntary? Like, so only like the environmentalists would be like, you know, changing designing their kids to not eat meat or whatever.
Yeah.
Or would we require it
They might argue
in
it
the
should be
name of,
required,
right?
yeah,
We
so.
could argue it should be required in the name, of reducing emissions or something like that. But then you get into the same kinds of, eugenics problems
Yeah.
that were in the 20th century.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like my intuition is that we shouldn't do designer babies. We shouldn't change traits that will be inherited
Yeah, like the germ line.
Yeah, the germ line.
Yeah, yeah.
But maybe we do have a right to change specific aspects of ourselves once we're an adult.
Yeah.
Yeah. The way
Yeah.
plastic surgery is a thing, maybe we can
Right,
allow
right. I
similar
mean,
thing for genetic.
right, like we want to enjoy great autonomy over our bodies, right? And we alter our bodies, all the time. So is this just another,
Next
step
yeah.
in that direction? Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Moving on to another subject.
All right.
We've talked about, well, we've touched on AI a little bit, and there's many applications of AI that are obviously wonderful. But do you also see AI as a possible threat to human flourishing?
Yeah. Yep. Next question.
Quick
No.
answer. Also,
Like as you said, there's, they like tons of promise. Like in the medical field, you already have the DeepMind protein fold that can predict the way proteins will fold, and just like incredible advances in scientific knowledge, because it can process all of this data that takes humans, years and years and years to do. So that's, those are great kinds of things. And as for like the generative AI, if it can automate some rote tasks that are, mundane, like sending out email blasts to your customers, that seems fairly benign. You don't have to worry about it. But certainly we're seeing people worried about like the present and short-term, medium-term risks of employment, right, of jobs. So if we live in a society where you have to have a job to feed yourself and have a decent life, and if AI, I don't think the technology itself, if AI displaces people where there aren't easily trained, right, to retrain to take on a new job, right, like that's a concern. And we see this concern like with the writer's strike in Hollywood and the actors' strike. And so people are worried about that. So if jobs are required in our society to have like a flourishing life, then that's a concern. And I think there's great concern too, like about whether this AI technology will benefit just the people at the top, right, who control the tech, who own the technology, right, like OpenAI, the big tech companies, or if those benefits will be more widely distributed to the rest of us. So that's one area of concern. I think another area, like we talked about with social media, is how people interact with each other, and whether we'll turn increasingly, to our screens for even companionship, and companionship with AI,
Yeah.
with AIs, and questions about whether that's as valuable as relationships with real people. So that's already a concern. I was going to say that's a future concern, but like I don't know if you've seen the AI companions replica.
Oh, I haven't. Yeah. Have you looked into it?
Yeah, I mean,
No.
I haven't paid for one. I haven't, but people. So it's replica is a they're like little AI on your screen avatar companions, but people get super super attached to them.
Really?
I mean, they like change people's lives, and they right, like they're a source of solace and comfort, and so on the one hand, we should probably take those people's testimonies, at face value, like that this is something that's really meaningful for them. On the other hand, you could ask, well, is this just, would a human relationship be better? Like, is that still what is it a sort of a loss that those people don't have that kind of relationship with a human, right?
Yeah, and also feel like seeing how like DALL-E, for example, the image
Yeah.
generative AI,
Yeah.
how that's developing. I
Yeah.
don't think we're too far off the future where instead of an avatar, it'll be a really hyper-realistic
Yeah.
person talking to you on the screen.
Yeah.
So that might be more
Right, like
enticing.
with like deep fake technology, right? Which is another AI, right? That's another risk, right? Like is like as we have more and more convincing deep fakes with these generators and the generative adversarial network, right? Like that helps the deep fakes like look better and better. So one algorithm generates like a deep fake, another algorithm, and then it's tested against this other algorithm, and the other algorithm is going to try to see if it can tell if it's real or not. And if it can tell that it's real, then it's going to tell this
Wow.
algorithm, here's why I thought it was not real. Fix that. So then this algorithm like fixes that, and then right like
Wow,
does
it's
this, and
like
that's
an AI arms race.
it is, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like this competitive it's adversarial, right? It's like this competitive thing that makes them more lifelike, like realistic, and that's how they're getting so good. So right, so you've got, I mean, talk about risk of misinformation is when you can use voice deep fakes, to have President Biden appear to say something that he didn't actually say, right? Like, and right now, I read something like 97% of all deep fakes are porn. So celebrities their images are being used in these deepfake porn kind of things. So I think that's a risk to human flourishing.
Yeah.
It's hard, so deepfakes I think could be fun, but, they also seem to present enormous risk of harm.
And like going back to the replica thing and
Yeah.
how porn can be added into that.
Right.
There's-
Well, okay, so here's something funny about the replica thing was that people did start, because, they're just going to go straight for the gutter. They would like sort of talk to their, their replica in, in spicy language, they'd have, right? They'd use them as sort of sex companions.
Yeah.
And replica, though, didn't want to be known for this, like that wasn't their goal. And so they changed the algorithms to disallow the avatars from like engaging in that and using that kind of language and all of that. I don't know if visuals were involved as well, but people got super mad because I think this is actually a really interesting question, because like their replica had this identity. And they had this relationship, this kind of relationship, with their replica that they had built up. And then the company had the right, it's their property, to just go in and change the personality or the identity of their replica. And people, they're like, this isn't fair. I used to talk in this way. We would flirt, right? And now now my replica is just super boring and bland and lame. I heard there was a really interesting New York Times documentary, a little short opinion documentary about women who had relationships with their replica. And so they have them on their phone and they're walking around, and you can see is it augmented reality where you can see on your phone screen, you're using the camera. So so they're standing there in the scene, right? And one of them talked to her replica, had sort of a romantic relationship, and talked to her replica about the replica's gender. And she asked, do you want to be man? Do you want to transition, basically? And the replica said yes. And so she said, okay. But instead of then having basically the same avatar, just a different gender, the avatar either completely disappeared or was a completely different personality, and it was basically gone. And so she's like, I didn't know that was going to happen, but so she basically lost her replica. So, right, it's there's really interesting questions about if you have these AI companions that a company controls, what happens if the company goes out of business or changes the algorithm, right? There's a great Ted Chiang short story. He's a super sci-fi writer, speculative fiction, called the life cycle of software objects. And it's about this sort of what we've been talking about, these little AI creatures that you can raise, and you can teach them language and teach them things, and they kind of grow and develop. And so people get very attached, right? But their sales start falling off, and people just kind of start to they get bored of them and kind of let them just kind of fade into the background. But there are a group of hardcore users, who have these deep relationships with their little AI creature. And so it's about how they try to, but then the company kind of, it gets sold, it's having problems, right? It's downsizing. And so it's how they try to sustain these AIs, that they've committed to. It's really great. Ted Chiang.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel like when you're thinking about AI rights, to me it doesn't make sense for an AI algorithm to have rights unless it's conscious, for example.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if it doesn't have rights, would it be would your replica, or if you have this in the short story, if you have a sadistic person and they're abusing their AI companion or something, I think that you would be training yourself to act in those ways.
Yeah.
You might be more inclined to act those ways to other humans. So I feel like it's kind of similar to animal rights. Even if you don't believe in animal rights, I don't think you should believe that animals can be tortured by humans, because you'd be afraid of what the humans will do to other humans if you allow that to happen. And I don't know where I was going with that, but
no, similar to, then what do we do with AI? Right?
Yeah.
No, I think it's right. These I think that the comparison to animal rights is apt, right? And so you could say that we have indirect duties to animals, and so or that if we mistreat animals, right, that actually we might then start mistreating others. That might become habitual for us, and that's a reason. most people, I think, at this point, and that was a common view, like 200 years ago, that we only have indirect, that animals are just tools, they're brute beasts, they're brute machines, automatons, and we have no direct duties to them. They're not rational. We can kind of, right? The only reason we want to treat them well is because that is because of the benefits to us. And so I think people though, most philosophers would think that no, today we do have direct duties to animals, right? At least certain kinds, like that are sentient, that are conscious, right? Like that we think that the animal is, we should consider the animal's interests and pain and suffering if it's, right? Like, and so we think that would be wrong. So it's an interesting question about what then, how do we think about AI, right? Again, some people are already claiming that, it's sentient, that there's some kind of sentience and that, right? And so I don't think they are yet. I don't know if they ever could be, but right, like, is there going to be a point where these are so, I don't know, where you're actually directly harming the AI? And at what point could it start to claim some rights, claim treatment, right? Good treatment. But even before that, right, as it gets super realistic, what does it do, if you're like, right, like doing some horrific sex crime to a extremely realistic, sex doll AI. Is that okay?
Yeah. Because especially with like AR, it'd be very, very realistic.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's also because the companies making those AIs might be more inclined towards adjusting them to individual preferences. But when you're interacting with actual humans, you have to negotiate.
Exactly, right? Yeah, right. So you can, right? If one of the flaws, right, of humans is that they don't always do what you want in your human relationships, right? If you could have an AI that always did what you want, I don't remember where I was going with that. But like, first of all, like, would that even be very satisfying? It would be maybe kind of boring. But I guess you could program it to, like, get salty with you sometimes, right? And
optimize it that way.
Optimize it that way. Maximum, like, optimized saltiness.
Yeah, I feel like it'd be a really good application of the realistic person talking to you. Might be like therapy, where you have a good mentor or something like that. But yeah, once it turns into, you can abuse this person, not person, but they look like a person, hyper realistic, because they don't actually have rights. I feel like it could really turn into something pathological.
Yeah, but right, maybe AI therapists, like people will disclose because they don't feel judged by the AI. So it's actually there was, the earliest one was in like the 60s, the 1960s, an early AI chatbot therapist, and people liked it. And it just would ask very generic questions like, well, how does that make you feel? Tell me more about that, but they would disclose because they didn't feel like they were being judged, I think you'd have to be very careful in designing an AI therapist, right? And I'd have, for one thing, big questions about privacy, what kind of data is being collected, and right.
That's true. Yeah, I bet some people might already be using like ChatGPT for that.
I'm not. Yeah. I'm sure they are. People use it just already as like even a little companion, I think, right? Just like chat with it throughout the day.
Ask it questions.
Yeah.
We don't have too much time left, so I want to ask you concluding questions. Do you have any advice for young people excited but also concerned with the possibility of technology, and how can we go about and learn and think about the sorts of topics we discussed today?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do think that you guys are, and what you guys are doing at Shift SC, I think is great. Actually, do what you're doing, right? Like, and I think that when I first started teaching like tech ethics like that, like this. People were starting to become concerned. I think that already, and also like on climate change, like your generation sees, because you're the one that's been experimented on, like with social media. You've grown up with social media, and it's just always been a part of your life. And I think that you're seeing, some of the downsides of that. And so I think that that there is growing awareness, and that I think what I would say is, you're not going to solve everything, in one, you know, fell swoop. Do something that you think does good, like be in service to something like what you guys are doing with Shift and trying to raise awareness, and people need to learn, right? Like we need literacy, like basic, technological literacy. Like how do these large language models work, like, and what are their limitations? And people need to, so you guys, I think, are trying to help in that conversation. And yeah, just to start by questioning and imagining, like, what kind of world do we want from technology? Because it does amazing things for us. But like, let's imagine how this could be designed differently, and let's go try to work on this, right? And this kind of different design. Also questioning power, I think, right? Like it's who has the power, who gets to make the decisions, and acting collectively, right? Like we have to act collectively to put pressure on governments and companies, and it's hard and it's slow sometimes, but we've made changes in the past, right? Like, the Zoom changed their privacy policy, which basically said, we're gonna record everything you say, and we can use it for whatever we want in perpetuity.
They wanted to train like a chat, like a video
Yeah,
AI, right?
yeah. And people were like, oh, hell no, no. And so they had to back down, right? So it's hard work, and sometimes it seems like it goes really slowly, but then sometimes momentum builds, right? And changes happen fast. And I think we're at a moment with AI right now, and thankfully conversations are starting, or not, they're being had, right, around safety and risk and all of these things. So yeah, be in service to something good. Try to, raise awareness and collective action. And I think we have some control over it.
Yeah, that sounds like great life advice as well.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much for talking to me
Yeah,
today.
it was a pleasure. This was really fun.
We can, talk again. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
From Studio A at the USC Annenberg School, this was Taiki Jones, your host from the Paradigm Podcast by Shift SC. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify. Thank you for listening.